Rain hammered the empty parking lot like bullets against concrete. Lucas stood under the warehouse awning, soaked through his jacket, watching the last bus disappear into the darkness. His phone showed 3 missed calls from the babysitter and a single text. "Ethan's asking when you're coming home." Then the black sedan pulled up. The window rolled down, and Vivian's voice cut through the storm. "Get in." He didn't move. She was his boss, the woman who never remembered anyone's name below management level. "Do you want to stay at my place tonight?" Everything after that moment would never be the same. Lucas had worked at the distribution center for 3 years, and in all that time, he had never exchanged more than 10 words with Vivian Harper. She was the operations manager, the kind of woman who walked through the warehouse floor like she owned every square inch of it. Her heels clicked against concrete with a rhythm that made workers straighten their backs and avoid eye contact. She never shouted, never raised her voice, but somehow her silence carried more weight than any screaming supervisor Lucas had ever known. The other workers called her the Ice Queen behind her back, and Lucas understood why. There was something untouchable about her, something that made the distance between management and labor feel like an ocean rather than a hallway. He climbed into her car that night because he had no other choice. The leather seat was warm, the air inside smelled faintly of something expensive, and the rain on his clothes immediately began soaking into the upholstery. Lucas tried to make himself smaller, pressing against the door, aware of every drop of water he was leaving behind. Vivian didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. She pulled the car out of the parking lot without a word, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm. "Thank you," Lucas said finally, his voice rough from the cold. "I'll pay for the cleaning, for the seat." Vivian glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable in the dashboard light. "It's a car. It'll dry." She turned her attention back to the road, and Lucas felt the conversation close like a door. He looked out the window, watching streetlights blur past, thinking about Ethan waiting at home with Mrs. Patterson from next door. The old woman charged $15 an hour for babysitting, money Lucas could barely afford, but she was reliable and kind, and Ethan liked her. That was worth more than anything. The drive to his neighborhood took 20 minutes in normal traffic. Tonight, with flooded streets and detours, it took almost 45. Lucas spent the time stealing glances at Vivian, trying to understand why she had stopped for him. In 3 years, he had never seen her do anything that wasn't strictly professional. She didn't attend company picnics, didn't participate in holiday gift exchanges, didn't even eat lunch in the break room like other managers sometimes did. She existed in a separate world, and workers like Lucas were simply tools she used to meet quotas and shipping deadlines. Or so he had always believed. When they finally turned onto his street, Lucas felt his stomach drop. The entire block was dark. Not a single light shone from any window, any porch, any street lamp. The storm had knocked out power to the whole neighborhood, and in the distance, Lucas could see the faint glow of emergency vehicles responding to what was probably a downed power line. He leaned forward, searching for his building, and found it sitting in complete blackness. The temperature outside had dropped to near freezing, and without heat, without electricity, his apartment would become dangerously cold within hours. "Which one is yours?" Vivian asked, slowing the car. Lucas pointed toward the 3-story building on the corner, the one with the cracked steps and the broken mailbox that the landlord never fixed. Even in the darkness, it looked shabby compared to the surrounding structures. He could feel Vivian's eyes taking it in, cataloging every detail, and something inside him tightened with a shame he hated himself for feeling. This was his home. This was what he could afford. There was nothing wrong with that. He reached for the door handle, already mentally calculating how many blankets he could pile on Ethan's bed, whether the gas stove still worked, so he could at least boil water for warmth. Then his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson. "Power's been out for 2 hours. Getting cold in here. Ethan's coughing again." Lucas stared at the screen, and the weight of the situation settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. Ethan had been fighting a cold for the past week. Nothing serious, but in a freezing apartment without heat, it could easily become something worse. He thought about the emergency room bills from last winter, the ones he was still paying off, and felt panic rising in his chest. Vivian was watching him. He could feel her gaze even without looking up. "Problem?" she asked, her tone neutral but not unkind. Lucas shook his head automatically, the reflex of a man who had learned never to show weakness to people with power over his paycheck. But his hands were shaking, and not just from the cold, and when he finally looked at her, something in his expression must have given him away. "My son," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "He's 8. He's been sick, and the power—" He stopped himself, embarrassed by his own vulnerability. What did he expect her to do about it? She was his boss, not his friend, not his family. She had already done more than enough by giving him a ride. Vivian stared at him for a long moment, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone screen as she checked something. Then she put the car back in gear and pulled away from the curb. Lucas watched his building disappear in the side mirror, confused, unsure if he should protest or thank her or simply stay silent. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and the heater hummed softly, filling the car with warmth that felt almost painful after so long in the cold. "There's a guest room," Vivian said, her voice cutting through the silence. "It has a lock on the door. You and your son can stay there tonight until the power comes back." Lucas opened his mouth to refuse, to explain all the reasons why this was impossible, inappropriate, dangerous to whatever professional relationship they had. But she was already speaking again, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Get your son. I'll wait here." He found Ethan bundled in 3 blankets on Mrs. Patterson's couch, his nose red and his eyes heavy with sleep. The boy looked up when Lucas entered, and despite his exhaustion, managed a small smile that broke Lucas's heart a little. "Dad, it's really cold," Ethan said, his voice scratchy. "Mrs. Patterson let me wear her husband's old sweater, but it smells like mothballs." Lucas knelt beside him, pressing his palm against Ethan's forehead to check for fever. Warm, but not alarming. Not yet. He paid Mrs. Patterson the $45 he owed her, money that would have gone toward groceries this week, and carried Ethan out to the waiting car. The boy's eyes went wide when he saw the black sedan, wider still when he climbed into the back seat and felt the leather beneath him. "Dad, whose car is this?" Ethan whispered, as if afraid to speak too loudly. Lucas glanced at Vivian, who was watching them in the rearview mirror with an expression he couldn't read. "This is Ms. Harper," Lucas said carefully. "She's my boss. She's going to let us stay at her house tonight because our power is out." Ethan processed this information with the straightforward acceptance that only children possess. "Oh, okay." He settled against the seat, already half asleep again, and within minutes, his breathing had deepened into the rhythm of genuine rest. The drive to Vivian's house took them out of the city and into a neighborhood Lucas had only ever seen from bus windows. The houses here were large, set back from the road, surrounded by trees and gates and the kind of silence that money could buy. Vivian's home was at the end of a quiet street, a 2-story structure with clean lines and large windows that probably cost more than Lucas would earn in a decade. She pulled into the garage, and the door closed behind them, sealing out the storm like it had never existed. "I'll show you the guest room," Vivian said, stepping out of the car. Her voice had shifted slightly, becoming something almost softer, though Lucas might have been imagining it. He gathered Ethan in his arms, the boy's weight familiar and comforting against his chest, and followed her into the house. The interior was exactly what he had expected. Clean, minimal, expensive in ways that weren't obvious, but somehow felt undeniable. There were no family photos on the walls, no clutter on the surfaces, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here rather than simply existed within these spaces. The guest room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a hallway that felt longer than it probably was. Vivian opened the door and stepped aside, gesturing for Lucas to enter. The room was simple but comfortable, with a bed large enough for both him and Ethan, a private bathroom, and yes, a lock on the door, just as she had promised. Lucas laid Ethan on the bed, pulling the covers over him, and turned to find Vivian still standing in the doorway, watching them with that same unreadable expression. "Thank you," Lucas said, meaning it more than he had ever meant anything. Vivian nodded once, a small movement that somehow conveyed acknowledgement, dismissal, and something else he couldn't name. "Breakfast is at 7, she said. "Don't be late." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Lucas alone with his sleeping son in a house that felt like another planet. Lucas woke before dawn, disoriented by the silence. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no pipes clanking in the building's ancient plumbing system, just stillness, broken only by Ethan's soft breathing beside him. He lay there for several minutes, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, remembering where he was and how he had gotten here. The guest room looked different in the gray morning light, less intimidating than it had seemed the night before. The sheets were softer than anything he had ever slept on, and Ethan had barely moved all night, his small body finally warm and comfortable. At 6:45, Lucas carried Ethan downstairs, following the smell of coffee to a kitchen that looked like something from a magazine. Vivian was already there, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than his monthly rent, reading something on a tablet while a pot of oatmeal simmered on the stove. She looked up when they entered, and Lucas caught something flicker across her face before it settled back into its usual neutral expression. Ethan, still half asleep, pressed closer against Lucas's shoulder, suddenly shy in the presence of this stranger and her intimidating house. "There's oatmeal," Vivian said, gesturing toward the stove, "and fruit in the refrigerator. Help yourself." Lucas set Ethan down at the kitchen island, acutely aware of how out of place they both looked in this pristine environment. The boy's hair was tangled, his pajamas wrinkled, and Lucas himself was wearing the same clothes from yesterday, now dry but still carrying the faint smell of warehouse work. He served Ethan a bowl of oatmeal and found some blueberries in the refrigerator, arranging them on top the way his son liked. The meal passed in awkward silence. Ethan ate slowly, stealing curious glances at Vivian whenever he thought she wasn't looking. Lucas ate nothing, his appetite killed by the strangeness of the situation. When Ethan finished, he looked up at Vivian with the fearless directness that children possess and asked, "Do you live here all by yourself?" Lucas felt his face flush with embarrassment. "Ethan, that's not polite to ask." But Vivian surprised him by actually answering, her voice carrying something that might have been amusement. "Yes, I do. It's very quiet." Ethan considered this information seriously. "That sounds lonely," he said. "When Dad works late, I stay with Mrs. Patterson, but I always like it better when he comes home." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating in the way only a child's words could be. Lucas watched Vivian's face, expecting coldness, expecting dismissal, but instead he saw something crack behind her eyes, a flash of vulnerability so brief he almost missed it. Then it was gone, and she was standing, clearing dishes, becoming once again the untouchable manager he knew from work. The power came back to Lucas's neighborhood later that morning. Vivian drove them home without being asked, navigating the still wet streets with the same efficient silence she brought to everything. When they pulled up to his building, Lucas felt the familiar weight of his real life settling back onto his shoulders. The cracked steps, the broken mailbox, the apartment where the heat never quite worked right even when the power was on. This was his world. The night at Vivian's house had been an aberration, a strange dream that was now ending. "Thank you," Lucas said as he unbuckled Ethan from the back seat, "for everything." He meant it to be final, a closing of whatever door had briefly opened between them. Vivian nodded, her hand still on the steering wheel, her eyes hidden behind expensive sunglasses. "I'll see you at work tomorrow," she said, and there was nothing in her voice that suggested anything had changed between them. Lucas closed the car door and watched her drive away, Ethan's hand small and warm in his own. But something had changed. Over the following weeks, Lucas noticed small shifts in the way Vivian interacted with him at work. Nothing obvious, nothing that anyone else would see, but he felt it. She would nod at him when she passed through the warehouse, a tiny acknowledgement that she had never given before. Once, he found a better parking spot assignment in his locker, moved from the far corner of the lot to a space closer to the entrance. When he asked his supervisor about it, the man shrugged and said the order had come from management. Lucas didn't need to ask which manager. Ethan's cough had cleared up within days of that night, but the memory of it stayed with Lucas like a bruise he kept pressing. He thought about what could have happened if Vivian hadn't stopped, if they had spent the night in that freezing apartment, if the cold that was already in Ethan's chest had deepened into something worse. The hospital bills from last winter had taken him 8 months to pay off. Another emergency like that would break him completely. He started picking up extra shifts, saving every dollar he could, building a cushion against the next disaster that he knew was always waiting around the corner. 6 weeks after the night of the storm, Lucas was working late when he made a mistake that nearly destroyed everything. The warehouse was empty except for him and a few other workers finishing inventory, and Vivian was in her office with the door open, visible through the glass partition that separated management from labor. Lucas had been thinking about her more than he should, wondering about the woman behind the ice, replaying that moment in the kitchen when Ethan's words had cracked something open in her face. He was distracted, and distraction made him careless. He was carrying a box of fragile equipment past her office when his foot caught on a pallet jack someone had left in the aisle. The box flew from his hands, crashing against the wall just outside Vivian's door, and the sound of breaking glass seemed to echo through the entire building. Lucas stood frozen, staring at the destroyed contents scattered across the floor, calculating the cost of what he had just broken, and knowing it was more than he could afford. This was it. This was how he lost his job, his income, the fragile stability he had built for Ethan. Vivian appeared in her doorway, looking at the mess, then at Lucas, then back at the mess. Her expression was impossible to read. The other workers had stopped what they were doing, watching the scene with the morbid fascination of people witnessing an accident they were grateful wasn't their own. Lucas felt their eyes on him, felt the weight of their judgment, and something inside him snapped. "I know," he said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "Go ahead and fire me. I know that's what you want to do. Someone like you probably can't wait to get rid of someone like me." The words hung in the air, ugly and unfair and completely untrue. Lucas regretted them the moment they left his mouth, but it was too late to take them back. Vivian's face hardened into something colder than he had ever seen, and when she spoke, her voice could have frozen water. "In my office. Now." She turned and walked back through the door, not waiting to see if he would follow. The conversation that followed was not what Lucas expected. Vivian sat behind her desk, her hands folded in front of her, and looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through every defense he had built. "You're angry," she said. "Not at me. At something else. What is it?" Lucas opened his mouth to deny it, to apologize, to beg for his job. But what came out instead was the truth. He told her about the bills, about the fear that never went away, about lying awake at night wondering what would happen to Ethan if he got sick again, if Lucas lost this job, if everything fell apart the way it always seemed to be threatening to do. When he finished, the office was silent. Vivian watched him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was different, softer, more human. "The equipment you broke costs $400. I'm not going to fire you over $400. She leaned back in her chair, and something in her posture shifted. "But I need you to understand something. The line between us exists for a reason. It protects both of us. What happened that night, with the storm, that was an exception. It doesn't mean the rules have changed." Lucas nodded, ashamed of his outburst, grateful for the mercy he didn't deserve. "I understand." But Vivian wasn't finished. "The rules haven't changed," she repeated. "But I'm not going to pretend that night didn't happen either. Your son asked if I was lonely. The answer is yes. I've been lonely for a very long time." She stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Clean up the mess outside. Take the cost out of your next 3 paychecks. And Lucas? Don't make me regret giving you a second chance." He didn't. Over the following months, Lucas worked harder than he had ever worked in his life. He arrived early, stayed late, volunteered for tasks no one else wanted. His efficiency ratings climbed, his supervisors noticed, and slowly, carefully, his relationship with Vivian evolved into something that wasn't quite friendship, but wasn't purely professional either. They would exchange words in the hallway, brief conversations about work that sometimes drifted into other topics. She asked about Ethan occasionally, remembered details Lucas had mentioned, followed up on things that mattered. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, Lucas got the call that changed everything. Ethan had collapsed at school. The nurse said something about fever, about breathing problems, about an ambulance already on its way to the hospital. Lucas dropped the clipboard he was holding and ran for the exit, not caring who saw, not caring about anything except getting to his son. He was halfway to his car when he realized he was still wearing his work vest, his ID badge bouncing against his chest, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his keys. Vivian found him in the parking lot, struggling to unlock his car door. "I heard," she said. "I'm driving." Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he could handle this himself, but his body betrayed him. He climbed into the passenger seat of her car and watched the world blur past as she drove faster than he had ever seen her drive, running yellow lights and taking corners like someone who had forgotten she was supposed to be careful. The hospital was chaos. Ethan had been admitted to the pediatric ICU, his condition serious but stable. The doctors used words like pneumonia and respiratory distress and observation period, and Lucas absorbed them all without really hearing any of them. He sat beside Ethan's bed, holding his son's small hand, watching the machines that beeped and hummed with every breath the boy took. Time stopped meaning anything. The world outside the hospital room ceased to exist. Vivian stayed. Lucas didn't ask her to, didn't expect her to, but she stayed. She brought him coffee from the cafeteria, forced him to eat sandwiches he couldn't taste, handled phone calls to the school and the landlord and Mrs. Patterson. When Lucas's supervisor called to ask where he was, Vivian took the phone from his hand and spoke in a voice that left no room for argument. "He's on emergency family leave. I've approved it. Don't call again." She hung up before the man could respond. On the third night, when Ethan was finally sleeping peacefully and the doctors were cautiously optimistic, Vivian sat down beside Lucas in the uncomfortable hospital chair and said something that broke him open. "When I was 26, I had a daughter. She died when she was 3 months old. SIDS, they said. No one's fault, just one of those things that happens." Her voice was steady, almost clinical, but her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white against her skin. "I haven't talked about her in 15 years. I haven't let anyone close enough to talk about her." Lucas didn't know what to say. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat there in silence while the machines beeped and Ethan breathed and something shifted permanently between them. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Go home. Sleep. I'll stay with him tonight." Lucas started to protest, but she squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "You can't take care of him if you collapse. I'm not going anywhere. Trust me." He trusted her. He went home, slept for 12 hours straight, and came back to find Vivian reading to Ethan from a book she had bought in the hospital gift shop. The boy was propped up against pillows, still pale but smiling, hanging on every word. When Lucas walked in, Ethan's face lit up in a way that made everything worth it. "Dad, Miss Vivian is really good at doing voices. She made the dragon sound super scary." Lucas looked at Vivian, at the woman who had built walls around herself for 15 years, now sitting on a hospital bed, making dragon sounds for an 8-year-old boy, and felt something inside his chest shift into place. Ethan came home a week later, fully recovered, with a bag full of medications and a follow-up appointment scheduled for the end of the month. The bills arrived shortly after, and Lucas stared at them with the numb resignation of a man who had been here before. But this time, someone else was looking over his shoulder. "The company has an emergency assistance fund," Vivian said, her voice carefully neutral, "for employees facing unexpected medical expenses. You should apply." Lucas shook his head. "I can't take charity." Vivian's eyes flashed with something that might have been frustration. "It's not charity. You've worked here for 3 years. You've earned it. Stop being proud and let people help you." He applied. The fund covered 60% of the hospital bills. It was the first time in Lucas's adult life that someone had helped him without expecting something in return, and he didn't know how to feel about it. Grateful, yes, but also something else, something that felt like hope, like maybe the world wasn't always going to be a place where he had to fight alone. The news about the layoffs came 2 months after Ethan's hospitalization. Corporate was restructuring, cutting costs, eliminating positions. The distribution center would lose 15% of its workforce. Vivian was the one who had to make the decisions, had to look at names on a list and choose which ones would stay and which ones would go. Lucas watched her during those weeks, watched the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders, watched the Ice Queen facade crack under the strain of playing God with people's livelihoods. He found her late one night in her office, long after everyone else had gone home. She was sitting at her desk, staring at a computer screen full of names, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were red. "I hate this," she said, and her voice was raw in a way Lucas had never heard before. "I hate every single thing about this." Lucas closed the door behind him and sat down across from her. "Is my name on the list?" Vivian shook her head. "No, but it should be. You have the least seniority. If I was doing this fairly, you'd be the first one cut." Lucas understood what she was saying. His job was safe because of her, because of whatever had grown between them over the past months. It was favoritism, plain and simple, the kind of thing that could destroy both of them if anyone found out. "Then put me on the list," he said. "I'm not going to let you risk your career for me." Vivian's laugh was bitter. "It's too late for that. Don't you understand? It was too late the moment I stopped the car in that parking lot." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. Finally, Vivian spoke again. "There's a position opening up. Assistant shift supervisor. It's a promotion, a raise, everything you need. I could recommend you for it." Lucas felt the trap closing around them, and everyone would think I slept my way into it. Vivian flinched at the words, but she didn't deny the truth behind them. Yes, they probably would. Lucas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty parking lot, the same lot where everything had started on that rainy night. "I've spent my whole life doing the right thing," he said quietly, "working hard, keeping my head down, never asking for anything I didn't earn. And it's never been enough. It's never going to be enough." He turned back to face her. "But I can't do this. I can't take that promotion knowing what it would cost you. What it would cost us." Vivian rose from her chair and crossed the room until she was standing in front of him. "Then what do you want?" she asked, and her voice was steady but her eyes were not. "Tell me what you want, and I'll find a way to make it work." Lucas looked at her, at this woman who had spent 15 years building walls and was now standing in front of him with nothing but honesty in her face. "I want to be with you," he said. "But not like this. Not hiding. Not pretending." The kiss that followed was inevitable, the culmination of months of tension and longing and carefully maintained distance. It was brief and fierce and completely unprofessional. And when they pulled apart, Lucas knew that everything had changed. There was no going back to what they had been before. They were either going to build something new together, or they were going to destroy each other trying. "The company has policies," Vivian said, her voice shaking slightly. "Relationships between supervisors and subordinates have to be disclosed. There are procedures." Lucas nodded. "Then we follow the procedures." Vivian's eyes searched his face. It could still end badly. People will talk. Corporate might decide I've compromised my judgment. Lucas took her hand, the same way he had in the hospital, and felt her fingers tighten around his. "I know, but I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of building my life around what might go wrong." The conversation that night lasted until dawn. They talked about Ethan, about the daughter Vivian had lost, about all the years they had both spent alone. They talked about what it would mean to be together publicly, the scrutiny they would face, the assumptions people would make. Lucas told her about his fears, his doubts, the voice in his head that said he wasn't good enough for someone like her. Vivian told him about her own fears, the terror of letting someone in after so long, the way she had convinced herself that solitude was safety. When morning came, Lucas drove home to check on Ethan, leaving Vivian with a promise to return. The boy was still asleep when Lucas arrived, Mrs. Patterson dozing in the armchair beside his bed. Lucas stood in the doorway of his son's room, watching Ethan breathe, thinking about all the choices that had led to this moment. The storm, the car ride, the night in the guest room, Ethan's illness. Every single step had been taking him somewhere, and only now could he see the destination. He thought about what Vivian had said, about rules and lines and the reasons they existed. She was right. The rules were there to protect people, to prevent exactly the kind of situation they now found themselves in. But rules were written by people who had never stood in a freezing parking lot, wondering how to keep their child warm. Rules were written by people who had never lost a daughter and spent 15 years building walls against the pain. Sometimes the rules didn't account for the messy, complicated reality of human beings trying to find their way to each other. Lucas made his decision. He would accept the promotion if it was offered fairly, through proper channels, with his relationship with Vivian fully disclosed. He would face the gossip, the assumptions, the raised eyebrows and whispered comments. He would do it because Ethan deserved a father who wasn't afraid to reach for something better. And because Vivian deserved someone who wasn't going to run away when things got hard. But first, there was one more conversation he needed to have. One that might be the hardest of all. The HR meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning, 3 days after their conversation in Vivian's office. Lucas arrived early, wearing the only suit he owned, a navy blue piece he had bought for his father's funeral 8 years ago. It still fit. Barely. And Ethan had helped him pick out a tie that morning, insisting on the green one because it makes your eyes look nice, Dad. Lucas had almost laughed at that, the idea of an 8-year-old giving fashion advice. But the truth was, he needed all the help he could get. Vivian was already in the conference room when he arrived, sitting across from a woman named Sandra from Human Resources, and a man Lucas didn't recognize, but who radiated corporate authority. The atmosphere was formal, professional, exactly what Lucas had expected. He took his seat beside Vivian, careful to maintain appropriate distance, and waited for the questions to begin. They came quickly, directly, without any pretense of small talk. How long had they been involved? Had the relationship influenced any workplace decisions? Was Lucas aware that Vivian had protected his position during the recent layoffs? Lucas answered everything honestly. Yes, they were involved. Yes, Vivian had kept him off the layoff list. No, he hadn't asked her to. No, he hadn't known about it until she told him. The corporate representative, whose name turned out to be David Miller, wrote everything down with an expression that revealed nothing. Sandra asked follow-up questions, probing for inconsistencies, and Lucas felt like a defendant on trial. Beside him, Vivian sat perfectly still, her face composed, her hands folded on the table in front of her. When it was Vivian's turn to speak, her voice was steady. She explained the sequence of events, the storm, the power outage, the decision to offer shelter to an employee with a sick child. She described their professional interactions over the following months, the gradual shift from distant colleagues to something more. She acknowledged that her judgment could be questioned, that she had made decisions that benefited Lucas, that she understood the appearance of impropriety. And then she said something that surprised everyone in the room, including Lucas. "I'm not going to apologize for helping him," Vivian said, her voice carrying an edge that Lucas had learned to recognize. "The company's emergency assistance fund exists for situations exactly like the one his family faced. His efficiency ratings justify a promotion, regardless of our personal relationship. I've spent 15 years giving everything to this company, and I've never once asked for anything in return. I'm asking now. Give us a chance to prove that this can work." The silence that followed was heavy. David Miller looked at Sandra, who looked at Vivian, who kept her eyes fixed on the corporate representative without flinching. Lucas realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to exhale slowly. Everything depended on what happened in the next few minutes. His job, his relationship with Vivian, the future he had barely allowed himself to imagine. All of it hanging on the decision of people who had never stood in a freezing parking lot, wondering how to keep their child warm. David spoke first. "The company policy on workplace relationships requires disclosure, which you've now provided. It also requires that the subordinate employee be transferred to a different supervisor to eliminate direct reporting relationships. Ms. Harper, if Mr. Lucas is promoted to assistant shift supervisor, he would no longer report to you directly. Is that correct?" Vivian nodded. "That's correct. He would report to the night operations manager, who reports to me only on quarterly reviews." David made another note. "And you understand that any future decisions regarding Mr. Lucas's employment would need to be recused from your authority?" Vivian nodded again. "I understand and accept those conditions." The meeting lasted another 45 minutes, covering every possible scenario, every potential conflict of interest, every safeguard the company required. By the end, Lucas's head was spinning with policies and procedures and forms that needed to be signed. But through it all, one thing remained clear. They weren't being fired. They weren't being separated. The company was willing to let them try as long as they followed the rules. Afterward, standing in the parking lot where everything had started, Lucas allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of a man clinging to the edge, but something stronger, something that felt almost like certainty. Vivian stood beside him, her professional armor finally cracking into something resembling a smile. "That went better than I expected," she said. Lucas laughed, the sound surprising even himself. "You threatened a 15-year career for someone you've known for less than a year. I think your definition of better needs work." The promotion became official 2 weeks later. Lucas moved to the night shift supervisor position, trading his warehouse vest for a clipboard and a set of keys to offices he had never been allowed to enter before. The pay increase wasn't enormous, but it was enough. Enough to move to a better apartment, one with reliable heating and a second bedroom for Ethan. Enough to stop worrying about every unexpected expense. Enough to breathe. The gossip, of course, was exactly as bad as they had feared. Workers who had once respected Lucas now looked at him with suspicion, wondering what he had done to climb so quickly. Women in the break room whispered about Vivian, questioning her judgment, her professionalism, her motives. Lucas heard the rumors, felt the weight of eyes following him through the warehouse, and learned to let it go. The people who mattered knew the truth. Everyone else would believe whatever they wanted to believe. 3 months after the HR meeting, corporate offered Vivian a promotion. Regional Operations Director, overseeing 5 distribution centers across the state. It was the job she had been working toward for her entire career, the recognition she had earned through 15 years of sacrifice and dedication. The salary was nearly double what she currently made. The prestige was undeniable, and accepting it would mean relocating to the corporate headquarters, 300 miles away from the life she had started building with Lucas and Ethan. She turned it down. When Lucas found out, when Vivian told him over dinner in her kitchen while Ethan did homework at the table, he felt something crack open in his chest. "You can't do that," he said, keeping his voice low so Ethan wouldn't hear. "That's everything you've worked for. You can't give that up for me." Vivian reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm not giving it up for you. I'm choosing something different for myself. There will be other promotions. There won't be another chance to be part of this." Ethan looked up from his math problems, his pencil hovering over a page of long division. "Part of what?" he asked, with the innocent curiosity of a child who hadn't learned yet that some conversations were supposed to be private. Vivian looked at Lucas, and something passed between them that didn't need words. "Part of your family," Vivian said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were bright. "If that's okay with you." Ethan considered this for a moment, the same serious expression he wore when solving difficult equations. Then his face split into a grin. "Does that mean you'll make dragon sounds when you read to me every night?" The wedding was small, just the three of them, plus Mrs. Patterson from the old building, and a few colleagues who had proven themselves to be genuine friends rather than gossip mongers. They held it in the backyard of Vivian's house, which had slowly become their house over the past months, with Ethan serving as ring bearer and reading a poem he had written himself about families that found each other in storms. Lucas cried during the vows, something he had promised himself he wouldn't do, and Vivian pretended not to notice, while simultaneously squeezing his hand so hard he thought she might break his fingers. 1 year after the night of the storm, Lucas stood in the kitchen of their home, watching Vivian help Ethan with his homework while dinner simmered on the stove. The scene was so ordinary, so completely unremarkable, that it took his breath away. This was what he had wanted without knowing how to ask for it. This was what he had been too afraid to believe he deserved. A family. A home. A life built on something more than survival. He thought about the man he had been on that rainy night, standing in the parking lot with water soaking through his jacket and fear soaking through his heart. That man had believed that asking for help was weakness, that accepting kindness was dangerous, that the only way to protect the people he loved was to keep everyone else at a distance. That man had been wrong. "Dad?" Ethan's voice cut through his thoughts. "Ms. Vivian says I'm allowed to call her mom now. Is that true?" Lucas looked at Vivian, who was watching him with an expression that held 15 years of loneliness and grief and hope, all balanced on the edge of this single moment. "That's up to you, buddy," Lucas said, his voice rough. "What do you want to call her?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Mom," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "She makes really good dragon sounds. That's basically the main requirement." Vivian laughed, the sound filling the kitchen like music. She pulled Ethan into a hug, and Lucas joined them, and for a moment, the three of them stood there in the warmth of the home they had built together. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like a reminder of where they had started. But inside, there was only warmth, only family, only the quiet certainty that some storms don't destroy you. They deliver you exactly where you need to be. The ice queen and the warehouse worker, the woman who had lost a daughter, and the man who had almost lost a son. They had found each other in the space between lightning strikes, and they had chosen to stay. Not because it was easy, not because the rules allowed it, but because strength was never about carrying everything alone. It was about letting someone else help you carry it. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you could do was also the most necessary, opening the door, letting someone in, and trusting that they would stay.